screen.
Sure. Obrigada, Inês. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Inês said, I'm going to speak to you about the sawfish research that I've done for the last 8 years, up until 2018, 2019. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So today I'm going to cover some of the research that I've done in a couple of different countries on sawfishes, and then some of the things I've learned about how we might go about protecting them. And I hope that this will be relevant also to other marine species, and especially to the context of marine species in developing countries or low-income countries. So one of my interests coming out of this work is just that I really learned that we need a lot of different approaches to conservation and the management of species that need to be locally relevant, and there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach. Inês, can I just ask, I plan to talk for about 45 minutes, so there's some time for questions at the end. Is that okay?
Yes, I think so. Normally we do about 30 minutes, but I think it's fine.
All right, I'll talk extra fast then.
Okay.
So I'll give you a brief introduction to sawfishes, what they are, a little bit about their biology and ecology. I'll talk about why sawfishes need saving. I'll explain briefly the research methods that are used for the work I'm going to describe. And then I'll talk about what I call 7 years of obituaries, 7 years of not so positive results. So some of the findings from my baseline studies. I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've done through the supervision of a PhD student in Bangladesh, and learning about the gap between research and putting that research into practice to protect species. And then I'll quickly talk about the possible future of sawfish research and conservation. So first of all, what are sawfishes? Well, they're pretty distinctive animals, as you can see from the image. There are 5 species globally. So if you look back to some older texts, you'll see references to 7 or more species, but that's because until about 2013, sawfish taxonomy was rather confused. So we now know that there are 5 species around the world. They live in the tropics and subtropics, and they mostly live in shallow coastal habitats, but they do often, or they do sometimes go into deeper waters as well. And on the IUCN Red List, 3 of those species are listed as critically endangered, and the other 2 are listed as endangered. So up until a few years ago, sawfishes were said to be the family of sharks and rays most at risk of extinction globally. They've been overtaken by the wedge fishes and giant guitar fishes now, but they are still considered to be a group of species that are very much in danger of extinction. And that's just to give you an idea of the taxonomy. So they fall within the order Rhinopristiformes, which also includes other families like the guitar fishes and wedge fishes. If you're interested in learning more about the 5 species of sawfish, including how to identify them and the differences between them, I'd recommend that you check out the website of the Sawfish Conservation Society. It has identification guides like this one on the slide that you can download for free, and those ID guides are also in lots of different languages, including Portuguese. So one of the unique things about sawfishes is, well, they're one of the biggest fishes in the world, as this photo really nicely demonstrates. They can get to be really, really huge. So at least one of the species of sawfish, the large tooth sawfish, can grow up to 7 meters in length, which potentially makes it the third biggest fish in the sea after whale sharks and basking sharks. And we think the green sawfish also can reach up to almost 7 meters in length. This animal in the photo was only 5.4 meters in length only. And it was one of the other unusual things about sawfish, nicely illustrated by this photo, is that this animal was caught in a river. So large toothed sawfish do use rivers and sometimes swim up into lakes to give birth to their young. The other 4 species of sawfish go into estuarine areas to give birth to their young. So they use a diversity of habitats, especially the large-toothed sawfish. As adults, they're found in salt water, but the juveniles can be found in entirely fresh water. And that means that they are vulnerable not only to the risks, to the threats in the ocean, but also to different threats posed in freshwater environments. When we talk about sawfishes, we have to be careful not to confuse them with one other group of fishes that to the untrained eye can look very similar, and those are saw sharks. So this animal on the right-hand side is a saw shark. And you can see there in the far right image, a fully grown saw shark. There are a number of species worldwide. They tend to only reach just under 2 meters in length. So they're a lot smaller than sawfishes when they're fully grown. And there are a number of other characteristics that make it easy to distinguish between saw sharks and sawfishes. You can see that the shape of the saw from a sawfish on the left-hand side here is quite different. The saw shark's saw is pointed at the tip, so it's quite triangular, and the teeth are very, very sharp, and they alternate between long teeth and short teeth. In contrast, this sawfish's saw tends to have parallel or close to parallel edges, and the teeth are more uniform in length, although that varies a little bit from one species of sawfish to another. And obviously one of the biggest differences, as I've already explained, is that sawfish can grow up to 7 meters in length in the case of large-toothed sawfish. The smallest species of sawfish, which is the dwarf sawfish, still reaches over 3 meters in length. So they're a good bit bigger than saw sharks. And the key thing to point out here as well is that saw sharks are in fact true sharks. So they have their gill slits along the sides of their body, whereas sawfishes actually are more closely related to rays. And so they have their gill slits on their ventral surface, as you would see in stingrays and manta rays. This image here also, I think, really nicely illustrates how huge sawfish can be. So why do sawfishes need saving? Well, in a recent study that I was part of, we were able to work out that historically, sawfishes have been present in 90 countries worldwide, if we look at all 5 species together. We think from the research that's been done recently that they have now become absent from 38 of those countries entirely. So 38 countries have lost all of their species of sawfish. An additional 22 countries have lost 1 species, and 37 countries have lost 2 species. So what you can see just from those numbers is that there are very few countries left that still have sawfish in their waters. And the study that produced those numbers is this study here, this paper that was published last year in Science Advances. It brought together about 6 or 7 years of really intensive sawfish research that followed from the IUCN shark specialist group, releasing a lot of information suggesting that sawfishes were highly endangered and really encouraging people to do more research on sawfish. So between about 2013 and recent times, there has been a huge increase in the amount of sawfish research happening worldwide. And that has meant that our knowledge of where these animals still exist and how they're doing is much, much better than it was 10 years ago. Unfortunately, it's also told rather a sad story. So this is one of the figures from the paper showing the historical presence of sawfish. And you can see that the dark red color over here around Australia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea is where there were the most species of sawfish. There were 4 species present. When you move over to Africa, there were 2 species present on each coast. And likewise around South America, Central America, and up into the US and Mexico, there were 2 species. So that was the historical, what we believe to be the historical distribution of sawfishes. If we look at where we think extinctions have happened, you'll see that this orange color again represents 2 species. So we think that we've lost both species of sawfish that were historically present from pretty much all of West Africa and an awful lot of East Africa. And there have been similar levels of extinction around India and Pakistan and around parts of Southeast Asia. So it's not a very positive story, but there are still strongholds for sawfishes, and those strongholds would be Florida in the US, where the small-toothed sawfish is very well protected and doing very well. The other stronghold that we know of is in the waters of Northern Australia. So you can see around the northern part of Australia here, that white color suggests that there have been no local extinctions. In other words, all 4 species are still present and they're very well protected by law in Australian waters. So the data that formed those maps are the results of consolidating research records and reports from many, many years. But just 5 or 6 years prior to that, the elasmobranch community didn't really have a good idea of whether sawfishes excuse me, still existed. I'm just going to get some water, sorry. Sorry about that. So yeah, just 5 years prior to this paper, we didn't have a good idea whether sawfishes were still present in much of their historical range. So I'm going to give you an idea of some of the research that was done in order to increase our knowledge to the point where we could write that paper last year. So the research methods that I've used are firstly looking at historical ecology, going back to old publications, using Google Books, looking at records written by old explorers to understand, just to dig out records of sawfish from 100, 200 plus years ago. Then my main method for research has been social science methods for collecting what's often termed local ecological knowledge or fishers ecological knowledge. This basically means conducting interviews and focus groups, usually with fishermen and fisherwomen, because they have an excellent knowledge of the waters where they fish, and they have they're out there almost every day a lot of the time, and they have a lifelong or a career-long experience in their head of the types of fish that they have seen, the types of fish they've caught, and whether there have been changes in those observations over the course of their lifetime. So that has proven to be a really useful technique. I also look for rostra, which is another word for the saw of a sawfish. And I record morphometric data on each saw that I encounter. And there are lots of other methods that are used for doing sawfish research as well, like tagging to learn about the ecology and home ranges of sawfish. But those methods are really only relevant when you're working in a place where there are enough sawfish that they're easy to catch. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case for most of my research. So I'm going to jump to one of my more recent studies, which was done in Madagascar in 2015 and 2016. There was lots of historical evidence that sawfishes were present in Madagascar. In terms of the methods I used, I conducted interviews with mostly fishermen and fisherwomen, but also sometimes fish sellers and boat captains. I asked them if they recognized the image of a sawfish, and then asked them where they had most recently captured a sawfish and when. And I asked them whether they thought that sawfish had declined at all over the course of their lifetimes, and what the reasons for that might be. I also asked people how they used any sawfish that they caught. And I looked out for saws while I was doing my research. It's hard to know when you're working in when you're trying to cover a whole country, especially one as big as Madagascar, with so much coastline, where to do your interviews. But because we know about large-toothed sawfish and other species that they use estuaries to reproduce in, and in the case of large-toothed sawfish that they also swim up rivers, this is a nice way to pinpoint areas where sawfish observations might be more common. And so because much of Madagascar's coastline is not accessible, I used the mouths of large rivers as focal points for my interviews. So some results, well, these are just some examples of historical ecology results. I was able to find a few photos with sawfishes in them. This one on the left from 1902 and a more recent one from 2005, both from the northwest coasts of Madagascar, and both very clearly large-toothed sawfish. That you can tell that by the shape of their saw. So I documented 30 sawfish saws in total during the study, and all of them were from large-toothed sawfish. And you can see, especially by the photo on the left and the right, that some of these saws were really, really big. They were over 1.5 meters in length in some cases, which suggests that the sawfishes were up to even over 5 meters in length. So really big adult large-toothed sawfish. This map shows the northern part of Madagascar, and the points show where I did interviews, where the letter I appears. The letter R shows the areas where I found sawfish saws, and this letter L here shows the area where there was actually a verified report of a sawfish landing, which I'll cover in a second. And this is the southern part of Madagascar, again, showing the areas where I did interviews and areas where I was able to get historical records of sawfishes. So I asked my interviewees when they had most recently observed a sawfish. And these are the results here. You can see that there were quite a lot of responses, over 30%, between 2000 and 2009. And around 29% of people said they had most recently seen a sawfish between 2010 and 2015. And there were, in fact, 16 really recent observations which had taken place between 2014 and 2016. And most interviewees said that they thought that the numbers of sawfish had declined over the course of their lifetime. So that bar chart might not look like much, but if we contrast it with a similar chart from a previous study that I did, which was in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, you can perhaps see the difference here. So on the left-hand side, in Guinea-Bissau, most people said that they had last seen a sawfish in the 1980s. Almost 40% of interviewees said the 1980s, and another 26% said they had last seen sawfish in the 1990s. So that was really where the peak of observations were happening in Guinea-Bissau, whereas a lot larger percentage of interviewees in Madagascar were talking about more recent years. So this was something that seemed quite positive to me. It seemed like I was hopeful that there may still be sawfish around in Madagascar. And when I asked interviewees what fishing gear had been used to catch the last sawfish that they saw, overwhelmingly people talked about nets, and especially about gill nets. And we know already that fishing nets are a really serious threat to sawfish because they've become very easily entangled in them. When I asked people what they used sawfish for if they caught one, a lot of people said that the meat was eaten locally or it was sold in local markets. People sold the fins of sawfish to middlemen who then sold them on to the shark fin trade for export to Asia. And some people used the rostra as either they sold it to tourists or they used it as a decoration in their own house. But many people said they didn't have any use for the rostrum. So in April 2019, after the study had finished, I received an email from a Malagasy colleague that I had worked with on the project. And he had received a phone call from a village chief in a village where we had done some education work, and we'd shown an educational film that we made about sawfish. And the village chief contacted my colleague to say that a fisherman in his village had caught the sawfish. So my colleague was able to go to the village and take some photos and verify for the first time in many, many decades that a sawfish had been caught. And so these are the photos that he took, which confirmed that it was a large tooth sawfish. It's kind of sad that the animal was killed, but at the same time, it was quite a positive piece of news because it does confirm that sawfish are still present in the waters around Madagascar. And then I'll just give you an idea of some of the work that I did in parallel with this research work. So I also wanted to develop some educational tools to help people in communities and also people in government ministries to understand a little bit better why I was doing the research that I was doing and why they should be interested in sawfish conservation. So this sheet here is an infographic that I produced for fisheries observers, because when I worked in Mozambique, some fisheries observers on the shrimp trawl fisheries told me that they had seen sawfish being caught, and I was very excited to hear that. And when they eventually sent me some photographs from some of these animals that they had seen, they turned out to be saw sharks. So I realized that there was a need for a really simple guide to help people know the difference between saw sharks and sawfish. So we produced this guide in English, Portuguese, French, and Malagasy, so that it could be used throughout East Africa and in Swahili as well. Then I produced an educational book, which was just a very simple overview of sawfish and why they're important and how they are an important part of healthy, balanced ecosystems. And this was written just as a kind of introduction to my research for people in fishing communities. A lot of the communities that I work with have low levels of education and possibly no exposure to science or conservation before. And so they were often really curious why I was doing the research that I was doing and why they should care about sawfish. So this book was produced as a way to get people a little bit more interested in sawfish, and also to explain about the concept of balanced ecosystems and not removing too much of any one species from an ecosystem. And we distributed over 4,000 copies of this in Portuguese in Mozambique and in Malagasy in Madagascar. And we also made an educational film with the same sort of message, which was distributed in Madagascar and Mozambique. So to conclude, sawfish are still present in Madagascar, and there are some remote areas where the mangroves are still in really good condition. Mangroves are a really important habitat for sawfish, so that's a good sign. But so what, right? I mean, there may be sawfish still present there, but Madagascar ranked 116th out of 119 countries in 2018 in the Global Hunger Index. That makes it one of the countries with the highest levels of malnutrition in the world. And when people are living on the edge of malnourishment, and when they're struggling to make a living, they can't really be blamed for not being very interested in conservation. So I think a key question for anyone who's working in a low-income country, especially one like Madagascar with a real problem around poverty, is whether our conservation efforts are likely to succeed, and indeed, are they ethical? Is it ethical to ask poor coastal communities to stop catching a species that's endangered when that species might be a key source of food or of income for them? So I'm going to skip over this study, but just very briefly, I did a similar study to the one in Madagascar in Papua New Guinea, over here just to the north of Australia. And I focused on one river system, the Sepik River, which is on the northeastern coast of Papua New Guinea. This was a study done in 2017 and followed up in 2018. And I did find sawfish there. They're much more common than they are anywhere in Africa where I've worked, and fishermen catch them quite regularly. And as you can see here, in terms of the most recent observations, the chart on the right-hand side, the vast majority of interviewees said they had seen sawfish in the last 7 or 8 years before the interview. So it's pretty obvious that sawfish are still quite common in Papua New Guinea. They're also really important in local culture. And so Papua New Guinea is now considered to be a global stronghold for sawfish, but they are still caught by industrial and small-scale fisheries. And there is very limited capacity or motivation for conservation in Papua New Guinea, which means that unless we come up with a novel approach for protecting sawfish in Papua New Guinea, they're probably going to go the same way as sawfish have gone in African waters. So there are a number of challenges for sawfish conservation in low-income countries. There is the continued promotion and use of gill nets and the presence of the shark fin industry. An awful lot of fishers know that if they catch a shark, they can sell its fins for a lot more money than just the regular fish that they catch. And so that's a big incentive for often very poor people to kill a shark or a sawfish instead of releasing it alive. There are the issues of coastal development and resource extraction, which can put pressure on sawfish habitats. There is very much the lack of capacity, both in terms of personnel and finances, to monitor and enforce laws. So whilst laws to protect sawfish can work very well in Western countries like the US and Australia, creating laws to protect a species in a low-income country are not always effective because there's nobody there to monitor those laws and whether they're being respected or not. There's things like logistics, just not being able to get out to the coast to access communities where illegal fishing may be happening. And there is, of course, poverty and the needs of human communities, which must also be respected. So this Western conservation approach that certainly that I was taught about and that I grew up thinking was a universal approach of using legislation and just banning the capture or the killing of certain species will not be effective in a lot of places. And I think it's important for us to realize that and to develop new approaches to conservation that are more relevant and more effective in different places. And there really is no motivation amongst rural fishing communities because of poverty. Poverty is a key driver. So if we want to overcome that problem, we really need to think not only about the species we want to protect, but about the well-being of the people as well. So this is what I tried to do in collaboration with Alifa Haq, who's a PhD student working in Bangladesh. She collected some data on sawfish landings in Bangladesh and realized that there are still a lot of sawfish being caught in the waters off Bangladesh. We published those findings, and we also published in that same paper some locally appropriate actions that we designed that are less around legislation and more around educating communities and working alongside communities to give them incentives to release sawfish. So we developed some materials that we could share with communities, like posters here on the left and in the middle. These were translated into Bengali, obviously. And then we also created a really simple summary of our paper, which included some visuals that summarized the key points from the publication and made those accessible to people working in NGOs and in the Bangladeshi government ministries of fisheries and natural resources. So just to finish up, I think that in terms of protecting sawfishes in places where they currently don't have great protection, we need to really choose our battles. We need to choose the places where it's more likely that we will have some conservation success, and then perhaps use the funding more wisely to select just a few places, and then maybe also to focus on other species like guitarfish. We need to really incorporate local socio-economic contexts. We need to incorporate local culture. We need to incorporate communities, involve them, get them to be a part of the process. Otherwise, we're a lot less likely to be successful. And there are, of course, other marine species that need funding, that need conservation focus. And so maybe some of the focus needs to go over to those species instead. And likewise, as I mentioned, thinking about livelihoods for coastal communities is one way of maybe removing some of the fishing pressure off these endangered species, whilst helping local communities to improve their quality of life at the same time. I'm going to skip through that slide. I just want to point out that if you are interested in learning more about sawfish, I've just produced an illustrated book, which is good for kids and adults. So if you'd be interested in having a look at that, please let me know. And yeah, thank you. And if you want to get in touch at any point, that's my email address there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I'd like to ask something. That's okay?
Sure.
Yeah, so really lovely presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I was interested, you've worked in in several communities like that, and you mentioned, and I agree that you need to find alternative ways to work with them, and legislation is not always, or like mostly not going to work in countries like that. So have you been able to find in any of these places alternative livelihoods, or just something that worked for them, that you saw that had an effect on how they, if it changed anything in their approach to sawfish fishing, or
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question, and it forces me to admit some of the major flaws in my own work, which is, I mean, one of the main issues that I have with my own work is that I've never been able to invest long term in any one place. And that's largely down to the fact that I haven't been able to find the funding to carry out long-term projects. It's not because I didn't want to. So I think this is a major flaw in research, but it's definitely something that I wish I had been able to push harder to do. A lot of my work has been just collecting baseline data and then taking what I thought was the next correct step, which was doing some education, some community awareness work, some awareness work with governments. But I was never able to take it to the next level, which was to start developing livelihood programs. And that was something I always wanted to do. So unfortunately, I can't speak from my own experience, but what I can tell you is that I've collaborated with a few NGOs on some sawfish studies. One of the NGOs was in Peru. We did a joint baseline study of sawfish in Peru and Ecuador, which hopefully is going to be published soon. And the NGO there, although that was their first time working on sawfish, but they've been working on manta fisheries in Peru for a number of years, and they had some great success with reducing the first of all, Peru is not the same as a low-income country. It's not classified as a low-income country, so the context is slightly different, but they did make catching mantas illegal through their work with the government, which was great. They do a lot of work with communities around education, both in schools and for adults. So they did a lot with the communities that were fishing mantas to make them aware of this new law, but then also just to encourage them to see the reasoning behind the law. And they involved some of those communities in their own research, and they set up a sort of kind of like a volunteerism project as well, which some fishermen could benefit from by taking people out on the boats to swim with manta rays. So, I mean, for other species like mantas and whale sharks, there are some great examples, like in Mozambique, where fisheries for mantas were sort of, NGOs came in and shifted those fisheries and got people involved in tourism and in taking people out to swim with these animals. And that has been shown to work really well for some species and in some contexts. Sawfishes are, I sometimes wish that they were a little more glamorous, because they like to hang out in really muddy waters and they like to live in places where crocodiles live. So you're never going to be able to develop a dive with sawfishes program, which means that, that's not a sort of a great livelihood alternative for people who catch sawfish. So that's a really long answer. It's a really long way of saying that I can't really give you any meaningful answer or example right now. But I hope we're going to get that way. I mean, there are great organizations working in Madagascar, for example, to improve people's standard of living by developing aquaculture programs. So they're developing programs to farm sea cucumbers, which are really high value products. And some of those people who work in the sea cucumber farming, a lot of them were formerly fishermen or fisherwomen. So by getting them involved in those programs, they're fishing less. And so you would hope that that sort of relieves some of the pressure on the wild fish stocks.
That's really interesting, actually. Just like, I mean, my question is more like, because I've done some work in Mauritania, and then I feel like West Africa is just such an area. It's difficult, like you said, like ecotourism, like, I mean, let alone tourism is not really a thing there. So it's rather hard to find alternatives that will really work. So yeah, I was just interested in your take, but the aquaculture thing is interesting. Yeah.
I think we have to be really creative going forward in thinking about other diversifying livelihoods for coastal people, so they're not entirely reliant on fishing. And you're right, in some places tourism just isn't going to work, and look at what COVID did to tourism anyway, so making people super reliant on tourism is not a good thing either. So you can, I mean, there's some great information on the work that Blue Ventures is doing in Madagascar. They've got sea cucumber farming, they've got beekeeping in mangroves, they've got a couple of other alternative livelihood programs going on as well, looking at sustainable crab fisheries in mangroves. So there's a lot of good work happening there.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? I think not. So thank you very much, Ruth, and very luck to your next works. And I hope you come someday to the CCMAR to see and meet other people personally.
Yes, I hope so. Yes, yeah. I definitely will as soon as I can. Thank you for having me, Inez.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.